Peace. This is Brother Hot Tim, and I'm coming to you with another episode of Folk Tales for Grown Folks. Now, I left off last time with a story called Witch with the Ugly Hat, and I'm going to part two. Um, Stay tuned to Folk Tales, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to upload all of the other stories that I did on Giami Journey so that you can stay abreast. As you can tell, I'm coming live, of course, from Shisha Lounge at 2369 North High Street, Columbus, Ohio, 43202. I like coming here because the vibe is nice. There's a lot of people up in here, and the hookah is popping. So we're going to have a good time. And I'm going to give you these stories the best way I know how. But once again, stay tuned, because I'm going to be uploading some podcasts of some past stories that I told on Giami Journey, which gave me the idea to start the folktale for grown folks. And I noticed some holes in the story because the stories flow in a sequential manner where there's lessons that come out of them. Now, I'm going to have an alternate ending for this for some of you that want to use this story later and tell it to children. But for adults, it's a little bit different. But the lessons are all the same. Now, in a lot of these stories, the term magic comes up. So let me go and give you a basic explanation of magic. Magic is basically an art, or even can be looked at as a science through which people are able to manipulate reality. Sometimes they use illusions, sometimes they use tricks, but it's knowing how things work. And in a sense, to be a true magician, you got to embrace the mystery of life, because in that mystery comes the magic. Because basically what we find out is that things that were considered magic in the past are now called science. So let's understand that when you call something magic, what you are admitting to is you're not being able to understand the qualities behind it, but are able to manipulate the forces. Let me give you an example of magic, and some of you out there might disagree with me. For me, walking is magic. I mean, I can understand. I mean, I could do it, but if you ask me to explain to you how I walk, I couldn't do it. So, in a sense, that would be magic. But since we do this every day, we look at it and we really don't think of it as magical. But think about all the stuff that has to happen in your body in order for you to walk. How much stuff has to happen inside your body just for you to talk? If you were asked to stop walking or stop talking or stop running or doing some of the things that you do until you were able to explain it, you would never be able to do it. So magic describes things that people are able to do, but we are not able to articulate how to do it. We are not able to explain it. So now let's get on with the story. So where I left y'all off last time, Prince Aquaman and Ariel were standing in a parade, and the prince saw a beautiful lady on a horse at the end of the parade, and he fell in love. And he found out that she was very cruel, and that all her suitors that came to her had to answer her questions, and if they were wrong, they lost their head. So the prince, after hearing this deepened his love and his desire for her. So he looked at Ariel and said, "Ariel, I want to marry that woman." And Ariel asked him, said, "Are you sure, young prince?" He said, "Yes, I'm more sure about this than anything else I have ever been sure of in my life. That is the woman for me. She was born for me, and I am going to marry her." So Ariel says, "Okay." He says, "If you are going to go and answer her question and put your life on the line, you need to go and get some rest." So the first thing they did was they found some food and found a room. And they shared the room because their resources was very, very limited. So Ariel reached into his pocket and pulled out his bottle of salve and rubbed his finger on it. I told y'all about that in the last story. And he rubbed a little bit on the prince's forehead as the prince sat down on the bed. And before the prince's head hit the pillow, he was out cold sleep. At this point in time, after Ariel made sure that the prince was asleep, Ariel reached into his bag and pulled out the bird's wings. He grabbed the sword that he got, and he grabbed the stick. And he took the salve and he rubbed it on the bottom of the feathers or the wings. And he put these wings on his back as if he was an angel. And he walked towards the window and jumped out. And lo and behold, he didn't fall to the ground. He was able to fly. And as he was flying, he just circled up above the city, waiting for something. But at the same time, the princess was in her room, and she went to her door, made sure her door was locked, and she looked in the mirror and she recited some words. And these words transformed her into a bird, and immediately she jumped out the window and flew out. And Ariel seen her, and he started to follow her. Now, I don't know how Ariel knew, but she was flying, and he was flying right behind her, and he flew very close to her, and she didn't understand, or she didn't know he was there, but he got close enough to her to where he could hit her with his stick. And as she flew, he whacked her 3 times. Whack, whack, whack. And she like, man, she felt the pain, but she thought it was raindrops. And she flew until she came to a mountain and flew towards what seemed like a cave, but it wasn't a cave. It turned out to be a house. And Ariel flew right past her and came up behind and snuck up on the house. And the little princess knocked on the door, and there was an old sounding voice saying, "Come in." And she walked in. And as she walked in, she saw this witch with the ugliest hat that you could ever see. I mean, this hat just was hideous. I won't go into the description because I want you to use your imagination on this hat. This hat was so ugly that the princess had to look away and cover her mouth so that the witch wouldn't see her dislike of the hat. So she walked up to the witch and she says, "I need your help." The witch says, "Well, what is it, my dear?" And the princess says, "Well, there's a young man." Well, better yet, I've been using the same question for months, and I fear that the answer to my question has gotten out. So I need a new question, because I fear that some young man is going to come and answer the question, and I'll have to marry him. And I'm not ready to be married yet. So the witch says, let me think, and start rubbing her chin. And she says, and she noticed that the princess was wearing some gloves. And she says, "This time you will ask them to tell you what you are thinking." She said, "That's what I did last time. Slow down. But this time you will be thinking about your gloves." So the princess looked at her gloves and says, "Ooh, dear, that's a good one." And the witch says, "Yes, they'll never think of that one." So the princess thanks her and walks towards the door, say her magic words. After the door is closed, turns back into a bird and flies off. Ariel is waiting for her, and he flies right up behind her again where she can't see him. And he starts whacking her again. Whack, whack, whack. And she flies straight home. And she turns, gets in the mirror, says the magic words, and feels her back because she's like, it's sore. And she starts to wonder if something is happening as far as the magic, or is the rain cutting her because she's flying too fast. But she's like, man, she lays down in bed and she noticed she has some little whelps on her back. And she's like, what's going on? And Ariel flies back to the house. And he lands, he takes off the wings, put them back in his bag, and wakes up in the morning before the prince and cooks the prince a nice breakfast. And Prince Aquaban come down to eat. And as they're eating and talking, Ariel stops in the middle of the conversation and looks at the prince very seriously. And he says, if the princess asks you to tell her what she's thinking or what she's thinking of, you should reply, her gloves. Now the prince started laughing and didn't really take this too seriously because he said there's no way this could be the question. Alright, so he leaves and he goes. He presents himself to the king of that land and he presents himself to the princess, and she got this ho-hum attitude about him, and she's looking at him like, oh, here's another victim. And all the guards are kind of excited because they haven't been able to cut nobody's head off in a while. So the prince bows to the princess and says, I am here to answer any question that you present me with, so that I might take your hand in marriage. She says, whatever. She says, okay, let's cut to the chase here. Tell me what I am thinking of. And the prince is kind of shocked because this is the exact question that Ariel told him at the table. And Ariel and the prince, Akaban, thought about it for a second. He says, I only get one chance, so I really don't believe in coincidence, but he looks at the princess dead in her eyes and says, you are thinking of your... And he pauses, and the men around him that work for the princess are getting their swords and pulling them out slowly. He said, you are thinking of your gloves. And she jumps up, angry, saying, there's no way that you could have did that. There's no way you could have figured it out. How did you know that? How did you know that? No, father, he cannot marry me. I cannot be taken that easily. He must have some trick or something, because I don't know how he knew that, but that's exactly what I'm thinking about. And the prince, because the king is about to tell her, hey, you got to keep your word. Now, you need to marry this man. But the prince looks at the lady and says, my dear, I believe that you are here for me, and I was born to marry you. So I will fulfill your wish and come back tomorrow and answer whatever question you have. And the prince leaves confidently, and he goes meet with Ariel, and he's excited. He tells Ariel that he guessed it, and Ariel says, are you going to be married? When are you going to marry? He says, I have to go back again. And Ariel says, what? Are you sure you want to do this? The prince says, I've never been sure about anything. So Ariel says, if you are going to present yourself to this princess tomorrow and answer her question and put your life on the line, we better get you fed and get you back to sleep. So they go through the same thing again. They go eat, and they return to the room, and the princess down on the bed. Ariel reaches into his pocket, pulls out the magic saw, rubs it on the prince's forehead, and before the prince's head hit the pillow, he's out cold. Ariel goes through the same ritual again. He grabs the sword. He grabs the stick. He pulls the saw out of his pocket, pulls the wings out of his bag. He puts the saw on the edges of, or the back of the wings, and attaches it to his back, and jumps out the window and flies. Once again, waiting for the princess. And just at that moment, as he's circling, the princess says her magic words in the mirror after making sure that her room is clear and that her door is locked. And she turns into a bird and flies out the window. As she's flying, Ariel zooms down on her, and once again, he begins to whack her. Whack, whack, whack. And she's like, ah! You know, she's screaming. She don't know what's going on. Because being a bird, she can't really see behind her, and plus it's dark. So she flies to the cave, and Ariel does his thing again. He hides, and he waits, and he listens. And she walks into the cave. She knocks on the door. She says, the witch says, who is it? It says, the princess. You got to let me in. There's an emergency. So she walks in, and the witch with the ugly hat, as the princess turns away, she strengthens herself to look at that witch in that ugly hat. And she says, a young man came in today and he guessed exactly what I was thinking about. The witch says, oh, did he? So we must come up with something else. So of course we'll stick to the same question, but this time, and she noticed that the princess was wearing a beautiful crown, she says, you will ask him to tell you what you are thinking about. She says, I know. The princess says, I know that already, but what should I be thinking about? And the witch looks at her crown and says, and points and says, "You will be thinking about your crown." And she starts to laugh because she knew no one could figure this out. Harel is listening very closely and intently. And the princess is full of joy because she's like, "I'm going to get rid of this guy because he should have never volunteered to come back, trying to outsmart me with his little tricks." So she walks towards the door and she goes out. She says her magic words, turn into a bird, and takes off flying. And Harel is right behind her. And as she flies, Harel comes back down on her with his stick and he whack, whack, whack her on her back. And she flies in and she's screaming and her back is sore. And she turns back into the princess and she looks in the mirror and she notices that the whelps are getting deeper. She says, "Ooh." She goes to bed and has trouble sleeping because she's in pain and she don't know what's causing the pain, but she know it has something to do with the magic. At least she thinks. Ariel flies back to the room with the prince, and when the prince wakes up in the morning, they sit down and eat their breakfast, and Ariel, in the middle of their conversation again, tells the prince, if the princess asks you again to tell her what she's thinking about, you should say she's thinking about her crown. So the prince looks at her more seriously this time. He takes note, and he leaves. And he goes, presents himself to the king and the princess, and he bows and says, "Princess, I am here to answer any question that you have." And the princess says, "Whatever." Crosses her legs, look at him in a dismissive type of way, and she says, "Okay, now, smart man, tell me what I am thinking about right now." And this time, the prince decides to add a sense of drama, so he sits silent for a little while because he could hear the men back there itching to chop his head off, and they start sliding the swords out, and you can hear the sound in the background. And right when the sound stops and he feels the presence of these men coming in on him to chop off his head, he says, "Princess, you are thinking of your crown." And she jumps up angrily like, "How could you know that? There's no way you could know that. There's no way." And the king, she looks at his father and says, "Father, there's no way that he could have known this, and I demand that he come back." And the prince says, "Hold on." And the king is silent. He says, "Your Majesty and Princess, now, I was challenged to answer one of your questions, and I put my life on the line. I came back and I answered another one of your questions. And to show my love for you, I will come back and put my life on the line a third time and answer your question again." And the king just shook his head. And all the guards shook their head in amazement at the bravery of this young man. And the prince turned around and left. And he told Ariel what happened, and Ariel was first thrilled, but Ariel looked stricken after he told him that he volunteered to come back again after answering a question for the second time, putting his head on the line. So Ariel says, "Look, you're going to have to get rest. I don't think this is a wise decision, but you definitely need rest tonight because this is it. You need to really get some rest." So they take him to the room, they eat, and he sits on the bed, and Ariel goes back up to Prince Aquaban and puts the salve on his forehead again, and before his head hit the pillow, he's out cold. He goes to sleep. And now, Ariel prepares again. He grabs his sword, he grabs his stick, he takes the wings out of his bag, and he puts the salve on the ends of the wings and attaches them to his back. Now, he straps the wings on and flies out the window, and he circles, waiting for the princess. Now, the princess' back is very sore. She's like, "Man, this is going to be the last time I do this because there's something wrong with this magic, and I'm tired of looking at that witch's ugly hat." And I'm starting to kind of like this guy. I kind of hope that he answers right this time. So she flies off to the witch. And as she goes to the witch, Aurel zooms in on her again. And he hits her 3 times. Whack, whack, whack. She flies and the pain is increasing because he's hitting the same spot. And she's like, oh my goodness, I'll never go here again. So she flies and she goes to the witch. She walks into the cave and the witch got this ugly hat on and she says, witch, I need your help. A young man has guessed again. She said he did. Well, I have something for him. This time you will be thinking about. And the witch started laughing. It says, this time you will be thinking about my crown. And she starts laughing, pointing at her head. And the girl is like, oh my goodness, he'll never think about that one. Okay, witch. But kind of remorsefully, the princess leaves and she turns into a bird and she flies off. But this time, Aurel doesn't follow her. He stays at the cave and he waits for the princess to fly out of sight. As soon as she's out of sight, he knocks on the door. Knock, knock, knock. The witch screams, who is it? There's no answer. Aurel just hides in the shadows waiting. He knocks again, and this time the witch storms towards the door in anger and sticks her head out the door and says, who's knocking on my door? As soon as she sticks her head out the door, and Aurel could see the ugly hat, he pulls his sword and he chops off her head. And the head falls and the hat falls. The head hits the ground first, and then the hat. As soon as the hat hits the ground, her body turns to dust. He takes the crown or her hat and he places it in his bag. Now, for some reason now, this bag seems to be magical because it expands and it fits this big ugly hat because this witch had a big ass head. Well, anyway, he puts it in his bag and he flies straight to the prince's room. And he goes to sleep, and in the morning when he wakes up, he's sitting down eating with the prince. And the prince is about to leave, and the prince is wondering why Aurel is not giving him any advice. And he turns around and says, well, Aurel, you don't have anything to share with me today? Aurel says, oh, yes, prince, it slipped my mind. If the witch, or if the princess asks you to tell her what she's thinking of, he takes off his bag, he hands it to the prince. He says, take this bag, reach your hand in it, and pull out what's inside. Now, the prince had questions, but he didn't ask. Because all this time, Aurel has not been wrong, so he figured he's not going to be wrong this time. So he straps on the bag, and he walks to the palace, and he walks in, and the guards are looking real happy because they know today they're going to chop somebody's head off. And the princess is looking quite remorseful, but the prince looked full of confidence. And she says, you again. Okay, tell me what I am thinking about. The prince falls silent. And the guards move in. And he bows and he looks up. And the guards move closer. And you can hear the swords coming out. And he says, And he reaches into the bag, and all of a sudden the bag expands, and it kind of catches him by surprise, and he reaches down and pulls out the ugliest hat anyone ever seen. The guards, out of shock at the ugliness of the hat, drop their swords. The king throws up, and the princess jumps up and is shocked and runs to him and says, how did you get that? And knocks it out of his hand and hugs him and says, yes, yes, I'll marry you. I will marry you. You know, and by that time she had decided she was never going to see that witch again, and she was kind of happy because she knew that if he had that hat, that the witch no longer existed. So he sat down with the father and started making arrangements, and he told the father his story, and the father was very impressed that not only was his daughter about to marry a prince of another province and someone who belonged to, in a sense, the Giami Federation, because the king was thinking about moving his whole kingdom into the Giami Federation. he was thrilled that he had a son-in-law or was going to get a son-in-law that was brave. But the young man said he needed to take some time. First, he had to go and tell his best man about his victory, and then he needed to return home immediately to let his father know of his adventure, because his father didn't have that much longer to live. So he left, and he first stopped to speak with Arel. He went to Arel, and Arel was looking joyful. He says, "Young prince, tell me, why are you so happy?" The prince says, "Well, as you know, I went to go talk to the princess, and I answered her question, thanks to you. And I want you to be my best man. Not only my best man, but I want you to be the advisor, my advisor, from here until one of us leaves first." And Arel looks at the king in a very sorrowful way. He says, "Well, young prince, our journey together is done, and unfortunately I can't be your best man." And the prince looks shocked. He says, "But I'm offering you wealth. I'm offering you a lifelong friendship and a lifelong bond and everything that comes with it." And and Arel says, "Well, prince, my debt to you is paid, and now I must return to where I'm from." And the prince says, "What you mean that? I never met you before that road." He says, "Oh, but prince, you did meet me. You don't remember paying those men those 30 gold pieces to rebury a body?" He says, "Yes, I remember that." He says, "Well, that body was mine. And I was so grateful to you that I begged for permission to come from the afterlife back to this life to assist you in your journey." And the prince was shocked. He says, "So you're saying that you are an ancestor?" He says, "Yes. But now I must return. And prince, I wish you the best in life." And he disappeared. Now the prince was sad because, he lost someone who had become his best friend, and on top of that, he was sad because all this time he was with an ancestor and he didn't even know. So he immediately went to his kingdom, his father's kingdom, and told his father about his adventure. And his father was well pleased and felt that he could die now and turn the kingdom over to Prince Akhaban. Prince Akhaban eventually became king of his father's kingdom, and eventually the king of his princess, or now his wife, died, and they eventually united both kingdoms, and they ruled it together peacefully. This has been Brother Hatim, and this is another folk tale for grown folks. Now, you could change the end if you're going to tell it to children if you don't want to spook them out, and you could just take out the part about the witch getting her hair cut off, because actually that's what it's about, the witch getting her hair cut off. And also there's another lesson in there about magic and about mysteries. In another story that I'll be telling soon, one of the things that I make sure the children understand, that when we're dealing with life, whether we're dealing with issues that we understand or issues that we don't understand, like magic, it's always best to get to the root. If you get to the root of the magic or the mystery and cut off the root, you solve the problem. Or if you deal with the root, you don't necessarily have to cut it off. But you got to get to the root of a thing to really solve the problem. And the root of the witch's magic, of course, was the hat. Because the hat was so ugly that it had to have some power for her to wear that ugly thing. And Arel must have knew this somehow. But that's my opinion. You get out the story what you need to get out of it. This has been Brother Hatim, and this is another chapter in Folk Tales for Grown Folks. So I hope you enjoy. You like it, share it. Look on, because I'm going to be uploading some new podcasts as well. And I'd like to thank you for your time, and thank you for your ear. With that, Brother Hatim says, peace.